Daniel and Emily Hawthorne seemed like the perfect couple, successful, charming, and admired by everyone who knew them. But behind the polished smiles and picturesque home, something far darker was unraveling. When Emily vanished without a trace, Daniel claimed she simply went for a walk and never returned. 10 days later, her body was found buried in a shallow grave, and the secrets Daniel had worked so hard to bury began to surface. What drove a husband to kill the woman he once vowed to love forever? The truth was more twisted than anyone could have imagined. Daniel and Emily Hawthorne were the kind of couple people envied. Their 2-story colonial home sat proudly at the end of a tree-lined street in Portland, Oregon, where neighbors greeted each other by name and garage doors were rarely locked. Emily was a beloved elementary school teacher whose warmth and patience made her a favorite among students and parents alike. She organized charity drives, baked cookies for staff meetings, and never forgot a birthday. Daniel, her husband of 12 years, worked in finance and commuted to downtown Portland in a sleek black car. He was quiet but polite, the kind of man who mowed his lawn every Saturday and waved to neighbors with just the right amount of enthusiasm. To outsiders, their lives looked seamless. Their home was always immaculate. Their Instagram feeds were filled with smiling vacation selfies, anniversary tributes, and tastefully filtered brunch photos. They appeared at community events together, held hands in public, and threw holiday parties that were the envy of their cul-de-sac. People would say they were solid, the type of couple who seemed untouched by the everyday problems others faced. But like a painting hung perfectly straight to hide a crack in the wall, the reality beneath was far more complicated. Over the last few months, subtle changes began to surface, barely noticeable at first, but enough to raise quiet questions. Emily had started arriving at school earlier than usual, staying later than necessary. She skipped weekend barbecues and turned down invitations she once would have happily accepted. Friends noticed the sparkle in her eyes had dimmed. She smiled less, and when she did, it didn't quite reach her eyes. She spoke about Daniel less and less, offering vague excuses when asked about him. Still, no one pressed too hard. After all, every couple goes through phases. Maybe it was work stress, maybe it was nothing, but something was wrong. And while Emily kept it to herself, the tension inside their home was slowly building towards something far darker. Daniel had changed, too, though not as noticeably. He still went to work on time. He still tended to the yard, paid the bills, and made small talk at the grocery store. But he had become more withdrawn behind closed doors. He spent hours in his study with the door shut. The warmth in his voice had gone cold. There were quiet arguments in the middle of the night, voices low but sharp. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now held only silence. One night, about 2 weeks before everything unraveled, Emily had told a close friend on the phone that she was thinking of making a big decision. She didn't say more, but her tone had shifted, more determined, more certain than before. The call ended with a promise to catch up soon. That would be the last time the friend ever spoke to her. No one knew what Emily had planned. No one knew how much she had uncovered or how close she had come to walking away. But behind Daniel's calm demeanor was a storm that had been gathering for months, maybe longer. Secrets were taking shape. Unspoken, dangerous secrets that would soon push their carefully crafted lives into chaos. When Emily failed to show up for work one Monday morning, her coworkers were surprised. When she didn't respond to calls or texts all day, they were concerned. But when the next day came and still no one had seen or heard from her, concern turned to fear. The woman everyone thought they knew had vanished without a trace, and the man they trusted to love her the most would soon become the center of a mystery darker than anyone imagined. The morning Emily Hawthorne didn't show up for work began like any other. Gray skies hanging low over Portland, the air thick with February dampness. At first, no one panicked. Maybe her car broke down, maybe she had a fever and forgot to call in. But as the hours passed and Emily remained unreachable, unease began to spread. Emily wasn't the type to simply disappear. She was meticulous, always on time, always responsible. She set 2 alarms each morning and prepared her lessons a week in advance. When she didn't return calls by lunch, her co-workers contacted the school principal, who then called Daniel. According to him, Emily had gone for a walk the night before and hadn't come home. He sounded calm, almost too calm. He said he assumed she needed space or had taken a break, that she'd be back soon. But she didn't come back. By evening, a missing persons report was filed. Officers arrived at the Hawthorne home to begin their search. The front door was unlocked, the house neat and orderly. On the kitchen counter sat a half-finished cup of tea. Emily's coat was missing, but her purse and phone were still in the house. Her car was parked in the driveway. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no blood, no overturned furniture. It was as if she had stepped out for a few minutes and never returned. Neighbors told police they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Some hadn't even noticed she was missing. Daniel, on the other hand, appeared strangely detached. He answered questions politely but without emotion. He said they had watched a movie the previous evening, that she'd seemed quiet but not upset. Afterward, she told him she needed fresh air and went for a walk alone. He fell asleep, assuming she would be back soon. But when morning came and she wasn't home, he didn't think to call anyone. He claimed he figured she'd stayed at a friend's house or driven somewhere to clear her head. What puzzled investigators was his delay. Why hadn't he called the police when she didn't return that night? Why didn't he reach out to her friends or co-workers? Daniel couldn't provide a satisfying answer. He said he didn't want to overreact. As the search widened, detectives spoke to friends, family, and colleagues. Most were shocked to learn Emily had gone missing. They hadn't seen her recently, but that didn't seem unusual. A few close friends mentioned that she had seemed anxious lately, as if something was weighing on her. One remembered her saying she was thinking about making changes, but no one had any idea what those changes might be, or that she might be in danger. Search teams combed the area surrounding the Hawthorne home. Drones scanned nearby parks and wooded trails. Flyers with Emily's photo began to appear on telephone poles and community bulletin boards. News stations aired her story. Social media campaigns were launched, but the more people searched, the less they found. No security cameras in the area showed her leaving the house that night. There were no witnesses, no tracks, no digital footprints to follow. Emily had simply vanished, leaving behind a house full of unspoken questions and a husband whose concern seemed thinner with each passing hour. Then, just as hope began to fade, a single tip arrived from an anonymous caller. A vehicle matching Daniel's was reportedly seen near a remote wooded area about 30 miles outside Portland the night Emily disappeared. The caller didn't give a name. The report was vague, but it was enough to shift the investigation's momentum. Detectives began piecing together Daniel's movements. GPS records were requested. Cell tower data was analyzed, and slowly, a picture began to emerge. One that hinted at something far more sinister than a woman out for a walk. The puzzle was far from complete, but for the first time, investigators had a direction. And what they would uncover next would change the case forever. 10 days after Emily Hawthorne vanished, a phone call came into the local sheriff's department from 2 hikers who had been trekking through a dense, wooded stretch of forest near a rural highway outside of Portland. They had stumbled upon a strange patch of disturbed earth, half covered by fallen leaves and moss. The ground looked like it had been recently dug up and hastily refilled. Curious and uneasy, they scratched at the surface with a stick. What they uncovered sent one of them running back to the car in horror. The grave was shallow and poorly disguised. Beneath the loosened soil and a plastic tarp lay the body of a woman, cold, lifeless, and unmistakably placed there by someone who had hoped she would never be found. The woman's clothes matched the description of what Emily had last been seen wearing. Her fingers were stiff, but the gold wedding band still clung to her left hand. Authorities arrived quickly. The site was cordoned off, every inch of ground carefully documented. Forensic teams worked through the cold afternoon and into the evening. It didn't take long to confirm the victim's identity. It was Emily Hawthorne. Her face was bruised, and the autopsy later revealed the cause of death: strangulation. She had been killed on the night she disappeared. The discovery of her body shifted the case instantly. This was no longer a missing persons case, it was a homicide. And with that, the focus returned sharply to the person who had been closest to her. Daniel Hawthorne had not made any public pleas for help in finding his wife. He hadn't organized search parties or shown up for community efforts. When detectives delivered the news that Emily's body had been found, his reaction was chilling. He didn't cry, he didn't ask questions. He only nodded, as if he had already known. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the Hawthorne home more thoroughly, this time with a new objective: to find evidence of murder. Every drawer was opened, every closet examined. In the garage, beneath a stack of old camping gear, they found something that had not been listed in the previous search: a burner phone, hidden in a shoebox with no charger and no identifying features. But once powered on, its secrets began to unravel. The phone contained a series of encrypted text messages, many of which had been deleted but were partially recovered through forensic tools. The content was deeply alarming. Messages included discussions about escape plans, coded talk about someone being out of the way, and searches for remote properties. There were also references to financial accounts, new identities, and a future that didn't seem to include Emily at all. Bank records painted a similar picture. Several joint accounts had been quietly drained over the past 6 months. Large withdrawals were made in cash. A credit card had been used to purchase plastic sheeting, rope, and duct tape weeks before Emily's death. But what turned the investigation from suspicion to certainty was the life insurance policy Daniel had taken out on Emily. A policy worth $750,000, 0 cents, signed just 6 months earlier, with Daniel as the sole beneficiary. When confronted, Daniel offered explanations that felt rehearsed. He said the burner phone wasn't his. He claimed the insurance was a standard precaution. He denied knowing anything about the burial site. But the data didn't lie. GPS records from Daniel's car placed him near the exact location where Emily's body was discovered, just hours after she was last seen alive. Despite the mounting evidence, Daniel refused to confess. But investigators weren't done. They knew the key to unlocking everything was understanding who Daniel had become when no one was watching. And as they delved deeper into his life, they would uncover a web of deceit, betrayal, and obsession that made Emily's murder seem not like a spontaneous act, but something planned, step by calculated step. As investigators peeled back the layers of Daniel Hawthorne's life, what they found was a man who had been living behind a mask for years. To the public, he was the mild-mannered financial advisor, the devoted husband, the quiet neighbor who never raised his voice. But behind the scenes, he had been weaving a dangerous double life, one rooted in deception, manipulation, and obsession. Digital forensics traced the burner phone back to a string of anonymous usernames Daniel had used to frequent private online forums. These weren't just casual chat rooms. They were communities built around secrecy and anonymity. It was in one of these forums that Daniel had met a woman under a false identity. He told her his name was Ryan, that he was a successful entrepreneur trapped in a loveless marriage, and that he was preparing to leave everything behind for a new life, one that he promised would include her. Over time, their relationship became more intense, more intimate, and more calculated. Daniel began feeding her fantasies of running away together, living off the grid, starting fresh in another country. He sent her pictures of luxury cabins and talked about buying land far from the city. He painted Emily not as a wife, but as an obstacle, someone cold, controlling, and impossible to escape without consequences. But the most chilling part was the evolution of his messages. They shifted from complaints and dreams to logistics and strategy. There were discussions about life insurance policies, inquiries about jurisdictions with lax law enforcement, and even references to case studies, other crimes, other husbands who had tried and failed to disappear their spouses. Daniel was learning from their mistakes. The woman, whose identity was eventually uncovered, initially claimed she had no idea about his real name or marital status. She believed the story he had told her, that his wife was emotionally abusive, that divorce wasn't an option due to legal complications, and that he was desperate to protect both of them from a toxic situation. But when shown the messages and the timeline, she grew visibly shaken. She admitted Daniel had begun talking about making a clean break just a month before Emily's death. Detectives also discovered multiple email accounts Daniel had used to communicate with fake identities he created to hide his financial activity and to redirect conversations with suspicious contacts. He had transferred thousands of dollars into offshore accounts and had purchased prepaid gift cards in bulk. Surveillance footage from a hardware store confirmed his purchase of the very materials found at the burial site. Still, Daniel insisted that none of it proved he had killed Emily. He claimed the GPS data was flawed. He said the burner phone had been stolen. He suggested that the messages were fabricated or sent by someone else. But the web of lies was too tangled, too detailed, and too deliberate to be explained away. Even more damning was a visit to an abandoned property on the outskirts of a remote Oregon town. Records showed Daniel had recently inquired about purchasing it, cash only, no contracts. The land was secluded, overgrown, and barely accessible by road. On the property, search teams found signs of preparation, a cleared patch of earth, a partially dug trench, and evidence that someone had been scoping the area. What became clear was that Emily's murder wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was the result of months, maybe years, of cold planning. Daniel hadn't just wanted freedom. He wanted to erase Emily entirely, to vanish into a new identity with a new life and never look back. He believed he was smarter than the system, that he could manipulate reality the way he manipulated spreadsheets and client accounts. But even the most carefully constructed lies eventually collapse under their own weight. And Daniel's carefully curated facade was crumbling. Fast. With the walls closing in, Daniel Hawthorne made one final attempt to escape the noose tightening around his neck. Faced with mounting forensic evidence, a digital trail of lies, and a growing public outcry for justice, he did what many guilty men do when cornered: he deflected. In a calculated move, Daniel turned on the very woman he had once promised a new life. He told investigators that she was more involved than anyone realized. He claimed she had manipulated him, that she was the one who hated Emily, and that she had pressured him into making dark choices he never would have made on his own. He portrayed himself as a victim of seduction and psychological control. He said he feared losing everything: his career, his reputation, his life, and that he had been blackmailed into silence. He implied that the woman had threatened to expose his affair unless he helped her get rid of Emily. It was a desperate story, full of contradictions, but Daniel was a man used to controlling narratives. He believed that if he could just sow enough doubt, he might walk away unscathed. But the evidence didn't support his version of events. Investigators already had a detailed timeline built from GPS records, surveillance footage, and data pulled from phones and laptops. The messages between Daniel and the woman, while disturbing, showed her unaware of the true danger Emily was in. She spoke in emotional, romantic terms, fantasizing about a future, not conspiring to commit a crime. The messages from Daniel, on the other hand, grew increasingly sinister in tone. They were filled with coded language, logistics, and phrases that read less like desperation and more like intention. Then came the final irreversible crack in Daniel's story. A security camera mounted above a gas station just a few miles from where Emily's body was found had quietly captured a time-stamped video on the night of her disappearance. The footage showed Daniel's car pulling into the lot. He stepped out, dressed in dark clothing, and paid cash for gloves, duct tape, a tarp, and a shovel. It was the kind of list that told its own story. The transaction took less than 6 minutes. He never looked up at the camera. Inside his home, investigators also found internet search history that Daniel had tried to erase. Among the recovered terms were, how long does it take for a body to decompose? Can police trace cash purchases? How to make a murder look like an accident? And how to silence a spouse permanently. The queries weren't accidental. They painted a chilling picture of premeditation, meticulous, emotionless planning carried out under a mask of normalcy. Faced with this mountain of proof, Daniel finally broke, not in a dramatic courtroom moment or under pressure from law enforcement, but in a quiet, private confession recorded during a follow-up interview. He admitted to killing Emily. Tons. He said he had thought about it for months, that he believed he could control everything. The crime scene, the alibi, the aftermath. That he wanted a fresh start, free of the responsibilities and emotional weight of his marriage. What he hadn't counted on was how messy murder really was, how many details could unravel a perfect plan, how real people, unlike spreadsheets and numbers, could see through lies. Daniel Hawthorne was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial was swift. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The story of Emily Hawthorne sent shockwaves through her community. People who had once admired Daniel struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the cold-blooded killer revealed in court. Emily was buried in a small, quiet ceremony, attended by her students, co-workers, friends, and family. Her grave is marked by a simple stone with her name and the words, "Loved, missed, never forgotten." Behind the manicured lawn, the smiling photos, and the social niceties had lived a dark truth, one that ended not just in betrayal, but in brutal, irreversible silence.